Good morning to everybody on the West Coast and good afternoon to all my East Coast friends. Welcome to Just Us Live. I am Ronald Simpson Bay, the Director of Outreach and Alumni Engagement for Just Leadership USA. Just Us Live is our bi-weekly Facebook Live discussion series. As you may know, Just Leadership is dedicated to decarcerating the United States by educating, elevating, and empowering the people and communities most impacted by systemic racism, to drive, amplify, and sustain the kinds of policy reform that builds thriving, sustainable, and healthy communities. Back in June, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we launched what we call the Just Us campaign as a nationwide call for policymakers to decarcerate the United States by immediately adopting federal and state-based policy recommendations to save the lives of incarcerated people during any type of emergency crisis or disaster. Today, we have a special treat for you. We are highlighting the role of the progressive-minded prosecutors in criminal justice reform. And today, joining me are Eric Gonzalez, who is the district attorney for the Brooklyn Borough of the City of New York. Mr. Gonzalez made history in November 2017 when he became the first Latino district attorney elected in the state of New York. Also joining is Lucy Lang, who was a former Manhattan prosecutor and current leader of the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution at John Jay College. Hello, Lucy. And Michael Kahn is the director of the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution at John Jay College. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Thanks so much for having us.
And as a disclaimer, I'd just like to state publicly that Just Leadership is a nonprofit 501c3 organization. So the political positions and comments of the panelists are their own and not the organization's. Everybody agree? Oh, Marilyn, thanks for joining. I didn't realize you had joined. I'd be remiss if I didn't introduce you. Thank you. And we also have, excuse me, Marilyn Mosby, who is the state's attorney general for the city of Baltimore. In 2015, Marilyn was sworn in as the 25th state's attorney for the city of Baltimore, making her the first African-American woman to hold that position and the youngest chief prosecutor of any major American city. Woo, man, kudos to you. Thank you for the work and contribution that all of you do. So I would like each of you to kind of take a brief moment to introduce yourselves. When I do panels, I don't usually like to be introduced. I like to kind of introduce myself. So D.A. Gonzalez, would you mind introducing yourself to the audience, please?
Sure. I'm Eric Gonzalez. I am the district attorney of Brooklyn, New York. Brooklyn has about 2.5 million people that live here. I entered this job because I cared about public safety, but I also grew up in one of the toughest parts of New York City in East New York during the crack cocaine epidemic that had hit New York in the 80s and 90s, and I wanted to make a difference. And I joined the office under the former district attorney, Ken Thompson. He allowed me to serve as his chief assistant, and upon his untimely passing, I was elected in 2017. And so it's an honor to be here. I consider the work of the district attorney's office very fundamental for the assurance of safety and justice. So thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining. Ms. Mosby, would you mind introducing yourself?
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Marilyn Mosby. I am actually the state's attorney for Baltimore City. I was elected in 2014. At the time, I was 34 years old. I was sworn in 2015, so it made me the youngest chief prosecutor of any major American city in the country. I am not the first African-American woman to be in this role. I'm actually the second. However, I was at one point the youngest. I've been in office for approximately 6 years. Sometimes it feels like 65 and a half years, but this is my heart and my passion, which was to reform the criminal justice system. And so, I'm excited to be here with my colleagues who are making moves all across this country. And I'm just happy and grateful to be a part of this progressive prosecutorial movement.
We love having you. Thanks for joining. Ms. Lang, would you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you so much for including me in today's conversation, Ronald, and everyone at Just Leadership. I'm honored to be a part of this conversation with leaders who I really admire. And I, as a national criminal justice reform leader and a former assistant district attorney, I know that being district attorney requires much more than prosecution alone. It requires engagement with communities, collaboration with communities, and taking a broad and deep view of how the system impacts everyone it touches, including victims, incarcerated people, their families and children, and the communities in which we all live. The need for that understanding is why, when I served as an assistant DA, I created a first of its kind college and prison program for prosecutors to come into prisons and take college classes side by side with incarcerated students so they could better understand and learn from those most impacted by the system. I brought that program with me to John Jay College, where I ran the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution until the end of this summer. And that program has scaled, and other offices have experimented with it, including DA Gonzalez's office. And I'm currently a candidate for Manhattan District Attorney and really thrilled to be here with all of you today.
Congratulations. Thanks for joining. Mr. Khan?
Thank you so much, Ronald, and it's wonderful to be here with everyone, and I'm glad to see some familiar faces on the panel. I'm the director of the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution at John Jay College. We're a think tank based out of John Jay College, and we really are a national platform to bring together community members, thought leaders, and prosecutors from all across the country to think about data-driven strategies and innovative thinking within the field of prosecution, particularly with a focus on implementing reforms that take into account community-oriented standards of safety.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And to our audience, feel free to type your questions into the chat box as we will be monitoring, and we'd like you to ask any questions that you have of our panelists as we join this discussion. And such a rich discussion is going to be. And like, hey, you know, it's happy election day, first of all, everybody, or post-election day. And I guess my first question would be, in light of the pending outcome of the presidential election, how do each of you see your work being impacted going forward? Feel free to chime in. No particular order.
Ronald, I think that this election season has highlighted for all of us that anti-racist district attorneys' offices are more necessary now than ever. That DA's offices have to take as part of their core mission ending white supremacy and policies that contribute to maintaining the legacy of racism in America. And another piece that I think has been importantly highlighted by this is the importance of the end to felon disenfranchisement. You know, the laws disenfranchising people for criminal justice engagement were passed after the Civil War in an intentional effort to suppress the Black vote. And I have been a leading voice in advocating for an end to that practice of restoring the vote to people who are incarcerated while they are incarcerated. Imagine a world in which elected officials or people seeking to serve had to go inside of prisons and communicate with people inside in an effort to gain their vote. That would drastically change the face of politics in America. And I think that it's been clear from the vitriol, animosity, and racism of this electoral season that that is critically important now and should be advanced going forward.
Absolutely. You said a mouthful. What do the rest of you guys think?
So I guess I will chime in, and I would say, if you ask the question about what does being a progressive prosecutor look like in practice, one of the things that I would say is that you can never underestimate the power of a prosecutor, right? And we've seen that all across the country. And the issue, I think, that is presented oftentimes is that you have to have the courage. You have to have the courage to be able to use your power and your discretion to reverse the effects of mass incarceration by, in essence, redefining what public safety and healthy communities looks like in the pursuit of what every prosecutor's mission is, which is justice over convictions. And I tell you that you have to have the courage because, having done this job for the past 6 years, prior to there being a well-founded progressive prosecutorial sort of movement, right? you're going to, when you're fighting against a system that was designed, to be quite candid with you, to dehumanize poor Black and brown people, it's doing exactly what it was intended to do. You are going to be, when you push against that internally, you're going to be harassed, you're going to be intimidated, you're going to be mocked, you're going to be ridiculed, you're going to receive hate mail, you're going to receive death threats. I can remember when I was one of the first prosecutors in this country to attempt to hold police officers accountable for the death of a Black man. I received a book of hate mail where they described how my husband would be coming out of my house and how no police officers would respond. And so you have to have the courage to be able to do your job. And at the end of the day, I was sued. But the overall goal is to reform the system from within. And so understanding and recognizing that you have one standard of justice for all, regardless of race, sex, religion, or occupation, you're applying that one standard. You're ensuring police accountability. You're taking a holistic sort of approach in attempting to break the school to prison pipeline. You're ensuring that you advocate on behalf of understanding and recognizing that your mission is justice over convictions, ensuring that you're advocating the same way that you are for those that break the law, but you're also advocating as a prosecutor for those that are wrongly accused, convicted, and incarcerated, right? When it comes to advocating for changes in laws, when justice and fairness require it. I had one of the largest police corruption scandals in the history of the country, where rogue police officers were planting guns and drugs on citizens for decades, right? What do you do with that? You advocate to change the laws in the pursuit of justice and fairness. When it comes to looking at laws and assessing and using your discretion in the implementation of laws that may be discriminately enforced against poor Black and brown people. I've come out, I have one of the most progressive policies pertaining to marijuana in the country, where it's not against the law in the city of Baltimore yet, but in the city of Baltimore, regardless of weight and regardless of criminal history, we don't prosecute possession of marijuana. When it talks about COVID and some of the issues that you're presented there, setting decarceral guidelines. And so, it's a number of things that amount to what a prosecutor and a progressive prosecutor is. But in the end, it's to reform this system from within.
Yeah. D.A. Gonzalez leads me to that's a great segue to the question I was also thinking for the prosecutors anyway, as to what is the difference between your ideology that you had going into the job and the reality you faced once you got in the job. Marion, you kind of touched on, but I'm just curious from Eric's perspective, what was that like for you?
As D.A. Mosby indicated, the goal of a person who wants to change the criminal justice system from the inside is to push up against the third rail of the criminal justice system, quite honestly. And so I look at it this way. What I didn't expect when I was running for district attorney was how often I would have to push up against the government in order to protect people. And so in my office, what that looked like was creating a policy that treated immigrants fairly and made sure that the criminal justice system could not be used to unfairly deport people and criminalize people here, because what we saw in Brooklyn, especially under the Trump administration, was that they were coming after people with green cards and not just undocumented people, but people with status, simply because they had a prior brush with the law for marijuana or drug use or something little. So it's been very interesting how using the power of the district attorney's office to actually protect the people that I serve from the overreach of government and law enforcement. And so we're trying to reduce the footprint of the criminal justice system, making sure that we take less cases on the front end. But for me, I think also really looking at how many people are impacted by our criminal justice system, how many people are incarcerated across the country. I saw the number of people from my home community in Brooklyn that have life sentences upstate New York. A lot of them don't deserve to be there anymore. They've been punished already. They've made the cognitive changes that are necessary to safely come home, but they can't come home. And so I've been working very hard to reduce the footprint, not only on the front end, but on the back end. So I created a post-conviction justice bureau. And it gets to the point that where these are my constituents. They may be locked up, but they are my constituents, and they deserve to have someone advocate on their behalf. And so I've been spending a lot of time looking at the back end of our criminal justice system, not just the front end. And I've been working with our legislature to get a look back bill, which will allow people, after having served a period of time, to go back and get resentenced, since we know that people are not getting released on parole and clemency. And so we believe very strongly here in Brooklyn that we have way too many people in jail, and they're not, that them being in jail is not keeping us safe. It's in fact, it's causing the opposite effect. They're being kept away from their communities. So much of our money is being spent on this big industrial system, and we could better use that money to support our communities, our families, and our schools.
Absolutely. Candidate Lang, what are your thoughts?
You know, I've been thinking a lot about the need for science and policymaking, as so many people have in light of COVID. And I think it translates really importantly into how we are going to think about handling crimes of substance misuse. And in New York City, where we're seeing an apparent increase in street homelessness, so many folks are suffering from substance misuse. And as jurisdictions nationally start to move towards decriminalization or declining to prosecute those kinds of cases, we really need other systems to start to step up and fill in the gaps. The answer can't simply be that we're not bringing people into the criminal justice system and therefore we're not doing anything for people who are suffering. I'm talking about a step beyond marijuana, as to what State's Attorney Mosby was talking about. But DA Gonzalez is just right that we need to be attacking this problem sort of from both ends, from the entry perspective and from the after the fact perspective, and maybe even taking more of a bird's eye view and looking at root causes. And these two prosecutors' offices and others are thinking more about what we now know about trauma and how the science of trauma should be informing the decisions that prosecutors make at every step of the system. And I think that is similarly going to inform the trajectory of the future of the progressive prosecution movement.
Absolutely. Director Khan, as you responded to the same question, I also wanted to ask you, what was the motivation for creating the Institute for Innovation Lab? I mean, you guys are doing a great work. So what was your motivation for creating, and tell us about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the first thing to sort of touch on that everyone on this panel has thought about is, I think there are two really distinct approaches to what it means to be a progressive prosecutor now. And the first one is thinking, where does the system need to be? And a lot of what the sort of first track of conversation we're having is, does the criminal justice system need to be responding to issues of mental health? Does it need to be responding to drug use? And how can we sort of prevent the criminal justice system from being the backstop that it's become for basically all problems when we don't have robust social services to deal with? And then the second point is, for questions that we do think it is appropriate to use the criminal justice system for, how do we sort of bring those systems together to work for everyone else? So, prosecutors have always touted values of justice, truth, legitimacy, fairness, safety, and dignity. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, for whom are those values true? Is there really justice for everyone in this system? Does everyone feel safe? And the answer to those questions, for the longest time, has been no. That has only applied to certain people that prosecutors serve. So I think a lot of what you're seeing now is prosecutors taking a step back and saying, what does safety mean to the people that have elected me? What does equity mean to them? How are we going to be seen as legitimate in all the work that we do? And sort of expanding that to really represent the community is a step that I think, we've spoken about on this panel, and that the DAs here have really been leaders in actually facing. And then as far as the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution, I mean, we really work to bring together community members, scholars, and progressive prosecutors, and really prosecutors from all walks of the country, to tackle issues that are of the greatest importance and understand sort of what are the data-driven solutions to solving some of those pressing problems.
Thank you. And that's a good segue into my next question. Director Khan spoke about safety and equity. And as I was watching the election results last night, I saw that the state of Oregon became the first state in the nation to decriminalize possession of small amounts of hard drugs, cocaine, heroin, LSD, and what have you. So I'm curious, what are your positions, the current DAs, and you as a candidate Lane, what are your positions on decriminalizing hard drugs in small amounts as well?
So if I could just interject in this,
Sure.
I guess, I think that there is definitely a role that progressive sort of prosecutors play in minimizing the harm that's caused to incarcerated individuals, especially throughout this pandemic, where we've seen this disproportionate sort of impact that it has had on, again, communities of color. One of the things that I think that we have geared towards, and I know that the candidate in Manhattan had referenced my marijuana policy, but what I want to highlight is that we in the city of Baltimore, we convened and we spoke with public health experts at Johns Hopkins. And we actually set decarceral guidelines and this goes back to my point about assessing what types of laws that we're actually going to use our discretion and our power to implement, right? And what we did is we called on the governor. We set our own decarceral guidelines that have led to a 45% decrease in those individuals that are in jail. So we are no longer prosecuting in the city of Baltimore trespassing cases, minor traffic offenses, rogue and vagabond, urinating in public, prostitution, and drug possession, right? Like those are the issues that have absolutely nothing to do with public safety, but could actually lead to a death sentence for certain demographics in this country. And so, understanding and recognizing, again, using your power, your discretion to be able to say, I looked at not just marijuana, but all of these other sort of issues that have nothing to do with public safety. And marijuana, it's counterproductive to the limited resources we have in the city of Baltimore, where 1 out of 4 homicides are actually being solved in our city. We need to divert resources and invest in ensuring that we're getting really bad guys off the streets, not prosecuting low-level offenses that have nothing to do with public safety. There's no public safety value in prosecuting drug possession and marijuana possession, right? And then what was most disturbing when I arrived at the decision not to prosecute the possession of marijuana in 2019, and again, since March of 2020, possession cases, is that when we looked at the discrimination of the way that those laws were being enforced. If you're nationwide, you're 4 times more likely to be arrested as a Black person for mere possession of marijuana. In the city of Baltimore, you were 6 times more likely to be arrested for mere possession of marijuana. And even after we decriminalize marijuana for 10 grams or less, and we issue citations, 95% of the citations that were being issued in 2017, 2018, 2019 were being issued to poor Black and brown people in the city of Baltimore. And so what I said was that I'll never be, complicit in the discriminatory enforcement of laws against poor Black and brown people. And that's the kind of power and discretion that you have as a prosecutor, not just in the beginning, of a case, but as my colleague stated, Eric, at the end of a case, at the back end, we have that power, we have that discretion. And that's something that we should often try to employ, understanding and recognizing that for far too long, failing to put on a turn signal ends up in a death sentence. Allegedly selling a loose cigarette ends up in a death sentence for certain individuals. Passing a counterfeit bill during a global pandemic for groceries ends up as a death sentence for Black people in America. And so understanding and recognizing that power that we have and that discretion that we have to use it in a way that's going to be beneficial and reform this system.
Absolutely. DA Gonzalez, any thoughts?
as part of my Justice 2020 safety plan for Brooklyn, I dealt with the issue that Marilyn is speaking about, which is in 2017, I made the decision that we would no longer prosecute certain types of marijuana offenses, which was simple possession. Then I said we weren't going to prosecute any marijuana cases, and the city, the mayor's office, the police department acted like, this was going to be Pandora's box to all kinds of horribles. But what we saw is in Brooklyn, prior to what's happening during the pandemic, where our shootings and our homicide rate are up substantially, we've seen in Brooklyn since 2015 all the way to 2019, a 40% reduction in shootings and a third in homicides. And so now we're dealing with the spike that is related to this pandemic, and we have to resolve that. We have to deal with what's happening on the ground. But we know that there's not that we can actually use discretion as prosecutors without having any increase in crime. In fact, we can reduce crime by being smart. So as part of my Justice 2020 plan, I have a goal of how we deal with drivers of violent crime. I think it's about less than 1% that is responsible for 60% of serious street violence. So we focus on those individuals, but we're moving our prosecution of cases to a harm reduction model in many ways. And so the use of hard drugs, like they've done in Oregon, we've been doing now for about a year and a half, where we're taking those cases, we're diverting them right out of the criminal justice system. We're having peer counselors meet individuals in our jails when they've been arrested and say the DA doesn't want to prosecute this case, but he does want you to take agency of your life and to get into some kind of treatment or program. It doesn't always have to be drug treatment. It could be mental health treatment. It could be other programs and services that a person needs. I leave that up to trained professionals to decide what a person needs. But if they do that, I decline to prosecute their cases. So there is a way forward doing this. It's been happening now in Brooklyn for a period of time.
Thank you for your input. I'm curious, Candidate Lang, I'm curious what's your thoughts about this, since you're aspiring to be in that office. What is your position on it?
I'm 100% behind both of these DAs and the ways that they've approached these problems. And in talking before about a public health response, only meant to distinguish what State's Attorney Mosby was saying about just outright not prosecuting marijuana cases and related cases. And I think that that's an example of the very intentional anti-racist policy that we want to see more of across the country. But with respect to a situation like Oregon and the decriminalization of more serious kinds of drugs, I do think that a public health response is warranted in lieu of simply deciding not to prosecute cases and walking away from them. And DA Gonzalez has talked about the meaningful ways in which they're seeking to do it in Brooklyn. The Staten Island Hope model is a strong one. There's a similarly strong model in Seattle through the LEAD program. And I think we can start to move towards more of a Portuguese style of responding to substance misuse above and beyond marijuana. And I hope that that's what the future holds.
Thank you. Thank you. Director Khan, in the Innovations Lab, I wonder, do you guys have any innovative suggestions of how to address this issue? Because it's something that's going to continue to come up and have to be addressed around the country. And instead of us having knee-jerk reactions, what type of progressive or proactive approaches would you, as from an institute position, suggest?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think sort of what you've heard is right. And the important thing to note is that while Oregon sort of did this through a legislative process, prosecutors who are elected officials and leaders in their communities have been using discretion since the beginning of time. And people who don't like their policies will come after them and say, you're not following the law. And the fact of the matter is what DA Mosby, DA Gonzalez, and Candidate Lang are talking about is exactly what they should be doing. They should be upholding the values of their community, promoting data-driven policies, and using systems that work better for the types of things that we're talking about. And the fact of the matter is, we know that possession of drugs in this country is not going to be solved by the criminal justice system. And so at the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution, we are fully behind these DAs and finding alternatives to the criminal justice system for drug possession.
Absolutely. I want to pivot just a bit here. DA Gonzalez, you mentioned in your remarks about a look back process. You want to look back for prior conviction. And I'm, as somebody that was directly impacted by a wrongful conviction, conviction integrity units are something that's very near and dear to my heart. So I'm curious to hear what are the positions of everybody on our panel here around conviction integrity units, and what are you guys doing anything along that line right now, or do you have any future plans for implementing such a process?
So on Friday, I had the honor of meeting a man who, Gerard Dumond, who had spent 29 years in jail on a wrongful conviction that my office was able to vacate on Friday, last Friday. I met him, his mom, his brothers, his sisters, his grandchildren. It was a beautiful moment. And in that case, you know, again, the human travesty that a wrongful conviction is. This man spent 29 years in jail, completely separated from the people who loved him. The true assailant was never apprehended. We had to break the news to the victim, the deceased family, that we had the wrong person. And, these things can't happen. It's the 29th wrongful conviction that my office has vacated since 2014. I've been involved in all of them as either chief assistant, as the DA, and it's the 12th wrongful conviction that I vacated as the elected DA since 2017. And so it's this work must go on. It's part of the conviction review unit, but it's part of the post-conviction justice work that we're looking at in my office, which also deals with parole and clemency applications, visiting people in jail, helping them, advocate for them, having strong reentry services, and also having a free sailing unit, because we talk about all the collateral consequences of conviction, Ron. And so we know that when people are convicted, we know they earn less, we know it impacts their housing, their education, and basically their relationships with others. And so we want to make sure that we conceal convictions when we can. And so what we created here in Brooklyn was a sealing unit that's free. And if someone comes in, they will come in. We will get them an attorney. We do the motion for them. We don't even make them go to court. The DA will go to court and say, upon motion of the DA and defense, we're asking that the court seal this. So this is something that we're taking very seriously in Brooklyn. But conviction review is very important for the integrity and of DA's offices. We have to admit our past mistakes. We have to acknowledge them. We have to try to make amends to the people that we've hurt. And we have to learn from those wrongful convictions to make sure that we don't repeat them. And so all of our wrongful convictions in Brooklyn are being studied, are being trained on, so that we don't make those mistakes. And I encourage all of you, and maybe we can make it available. I released a report on July 9th of this year, 426 years. It takes a look at 25 wrongful convictions that came out of the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. These 24 men and 1 woman, 24 out of 25 were people of color, Black or Latino, spent 426 years in jail on wrongful convictions. 3 of those men never got out of jail because they died in prison. We had to vacate their convictions after their death. But we have to acknowledge the harms that we have caused as prosecutors and make amends for those harms. And so I encourage everyone to read the report. 2 quick takeaways from the report. Most wrongful convictions are caused by a multitude of problems. It's not usually just one error in the case that causes a wrongful conviction. There are normally a lot of errors. We've learned about witness identification issues and false science and false confessions. There's a lot of science that we've learned about. But the second part that we've learned about is bias confirmation going a long way. ADAs handle cases and truly don't believe that the person before them could be innocent. They may understand that they have a presumption of innocence, but factual innocence is something that we have to make sure our prosecutors really understand and really believe in, so that they can really investigate alibis and not allow bias confirmation to get them down the wrong path. And finally, these wrongful convictions are truly avoidable with more training and more understanding that the people before us are brothers and sisters and have to be treated with human dignity. We can prevent most of these wrongful convictions from happening.
Go ahead, D.A. Mosby.
So the one thing I would just add before I talk about the conviction integrity, and I mean, you just heard from the guru, right? The DA Eric Gonzalez represents one of the premier conviction integrity units in the entire country. The one thing I do want to just touch upon before I go there is that, candidate Lang had discussed the need for us to take a public health sort of approach to drug possession and not just mere marijuana possession. The one thing that I would point out is that, once you're in the position, and we kind of see this right now with the election where you have, major municipalities that lean towards progressive sort of approaches and a perspective, but you have the outstanding sort of conservative approaches and perspective about criminal justice reform. And so you have to deal with what you are dealt. You have to handle the cards that you are dealt, right? And so understanding and recognizing that these laws, I had the awesome opportunity, along with my colleague Eric, to be able to go to Germany and to Portugal and to see where they've decriminalized all drugs, right? And to see that there's no sort of public safety value in continuing to prosecute these types of offenses. And so understanding and recognizing that my state may not necessarily be where I am, I have the power as a prosecutor and the discretion to use it. And so what I've done in making the decision not to prosecute marijuana and all drugs is that we've seen a 75% sort of decrease in the drug possession arrests right now. And so I have, the treatment facilities that are going out of business because they've based their business model off the backs of criminalizing poor Black and brown people. And what I've said is, I don't care if that's your business model. We're not going to continue to do that. That's the kind of discretion that prosecutors in elected positions hold and have to ensure that we implement, right? That's one. And then your question pertaining to the, and I will also note that all of those individuals, we've also quashed and dismissed over 600 cases of underlying offenses, most of which were drug possession. But of that, when we step outside of drug possession, conviction integrity, I had one of the first conviction integrity units in the entire state of Maryland. And under my administration, I had the awesome opportunity when I first took office. I traveled to different district attorneys' offices to see what best practices we can employ in Baltimore City. I had the awesome opportunity of meeting Eric Gonzalez along with the late, great Ken Thompson, who was known for their conviction integrity unit. And I was able to replicate a unit similar to theirs, in which we've had 9 exonerations of 9 innocent individuals who cumulatively have spent almost 250 years incarcerated for crimes that they did not commit. Right? Like, so at the end of the day, when I bring it back to the mission of a prosecutor, which is justice over convictions, and we have to be able to advocate for those that are wrongly convicted, incarcerated for years. And so we're doing that in the city of Baltimore, but it has to go beyond that. I had the awesome opportunity of going down to the state legislature and advocating for exoneree compensation to mandate that when you committed 34 years of your life for a crime that you didn't commit, and you're in a facility where your family, you've made so many sacrifices, you should be compensated for that, right? That's the kind of authority that a progressive prosecutor has to be able to implement. In addition to the conviction integrity unit, which is, I think, should be replicated all throughout every sort of district attorney's offices. One of the things that we're also looking into is these sentencing review units, and creating a sentencing review unit where we're looking at these heinous and egregious sort of sentences that were imposed. And unfortunately, again, just like the criminal justice system in and of itself, disproportionately impacting poor Black and brown people. So it goes beyond the mere traditional case processing of a prosecutor, understanding and recognizing that discretion and that power that you have goes way beyond just case processing, and that you have the power and the ability to implement what people in America are looking for, which is really the implementation of justice.
Absolutely. Candidate Lang, what would be your attitudes about conviction integrity unit and sentencing review upon you if you got into office?
Yes to everything that my colleagues have said. And I would just point to how thoughtfully they are articulating a vision that is not just about factual innocence, but is really about whether the impact of the system is consistent with contemporary values and best practices. So I would add only to what they've said that these are appropriate times to look at things like elder parole and review of sentences that are no longer consistent with contemporary mores, and other ways to help shrink the system's impact on people who may not be wrongfully convicted, but who have nonetheless been wronged by the system in terms of how they have been treated. So ceilings, clemency, elder parole, lengthy sentence review, advocating for parole where appropriate, et cetera, are all on the table and should be part of a modern, innovative prosecutor's office.
And I would love to send to all of you the look back bill so that we can get some support here in Albany for it, because it's exactly what that's meant to do. It's meant to give a valve for people who have already served their time, who are ready to be released, a chance to get released, because we know that parole and clemency is not getting it done.
Exactly. Director,
and then
just what I'm thinking about. I want to lose my train of thought. Director Khan, I mean, I'm thinking about the statistics that the University of Michigan, they have an innocence project at the law school, and since 1989, there have been almost 3,000 wrong conviction that they've documented. But as anybody knows, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, barely the tip of the iceberg. And it feels like these review units are kind of like drip, 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 drip. They're addressing issues, but they're real slow on getting it done. So do you have any innovative suggestions that could, that could improve this whole process?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think really what it comes down to, and there's a couple different dueling models out there of sort of what these conviction integrity units should look like in sort of the academic literature. But fundamentally, what they come down to is it needs to be a priority for all progressive prosecutors. If you're to be a prosecutor in this country and maintain any sort of sense of legitimacy, you have to be able to ensure that your convictions are fair and legitimate and run properly. And the only way to do that is to provide ample and resources that match sort of the other units in your office and properly equip the conviction review unit to do the job that it was tasked with.
Were you, Candidate Lang, did you want to add something? I didn't mean to cut you off.
Not at all. Just that I think this conversation highlights the gap around reentry services. And when people are released, whether because they have been exonerated, because there has been someone who's advocated for clemency, or simply because their sentence has concluded, that we are categorically failing those folks. I have had the good fortune to spend the past few years teaching in New York's reentry facility, and I have been endlessly heartbroken to see my formerly incarcerated students who come home and are not supported by the system that is supposed to be there to catch them. So we need to think about housing first models and other kinds of supportive systems to help people re-enter successfully and build towards thriving lives.
And if I could just interject, the only one thing I would say is that we're not necessarily failing from a re-entry perspective. One of the things that we did in my office is that we started a re-entry sort of service for our exonerees. It's called Resurrection After Exoneration, where we've connected our exonerees to the mental health treatment that is necessary when you've been incarcerated for 34 years for a crime that you did not commit, right? We provide them medical services, employment opportunities, and connect them to providing and obtaining the skills, the requisite job skills training that is necessary. So I think that we definitely see the need, and there should be more, not only conviction integrity units, but also meeting the needs within respective sort of jurisdictions where they're also meeting the re-entry sort of needs. This was actually brought to our attention with our first exoneree, who was wrongly convicted and incarcerated for more than 17 years for a murder that he allegedly committed committed that he did not commit. And it was only after, he had been exonerated, 3 months later, he died. Just from trying to get reacclimated into society. He couldn't get an identification. He couldn't get, he had his social security card, but he couldn't get a job. It was like he didn't have any mental health treatment. And we sat down with that family and we had the opportunity to see not only how it impacted him, but also that family. And so what we wanted to be able to do was to say, okay, we have wronged you in the worst case that you could ever imagine from a government perspective. And as Eric has already stated, you have to be able to and be willing to acknowledge and apologize on a system that can erroneously take somebody's life for 17 years, right? We acknowledge that, but we also have to acknowledge the need of that individual to reacclimate themselves into society. Yeah. And so it's happening, but it could be happening on a broader sort of scale.
I'm glad you raised it because some of the questions that's coming in from our audience is around reentry. And could you guys kind of shed a little more light on what do you feel that what is the role of prosecutors and DAs in reentry? Because I don't know, I'm not sure of the connection myself, and I'm sure our audience would love to hear your thoughts because they're asking about, they want prosecutors to be more involved in the reentry process as well. So what does that look like from your perspectives?
I'm fortunate because here in New York City, my office has a reentry bureau that I inherited when I came into office. It was already here. It's really, we're committed to it. It's funded by my office. A lot of these reentry work is only funded by, grants or federal grants, but we're actually putting our budget towards the work that we're doing around reentry. We have a task force with a lot of community partners. We meet monthly, and we're providing services for upwards of 900 people at a year. But that's more that needs to be done. And it's around the things that Marilyn said. It's around health services. It's around housing. It's around trying to get people in school, trying to job skills and job training, helping them to get jobs. It's about helping reestablish people. So when someone comes out of jail, often they've been separated from their belongings. They don't have IDs. They don't have their birth certificates. My office goes with them to obtain all of this stuff, to get them identification, to get them their birth certificates, to get them the things they need in order just to do basic things in their life. And then we try to do wraparound services around them to make them successful. But the question, I think, Ron, was, why is it important? It's important because the role of the prosecutor around justice and safety means restoring people in our communities in successful ways. That if people are coming back home, putting them in positions to succeed and putting their families in positions to help them. So we try to provide services not only to the formerly incarcerated person, but the impacted family to make sure that they're able to bring someone home and not leave them necessarily in a homeless shelter and that kind of situation. And we think that if we're successful in restoring someone after they come home, they're less likely to fall back and get themselves in trouble or get rearrested or commit more crime. So our communities are going to be safer. But I think that is the messaging that DAs have to tell the community, is that this is the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do in terms of crime prevention.
Director Khan, did you or Candidate Lang have any thoughts around reentry and prosecution?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we do at the IIP that I think is a really valuable and eye-opening exercise is we've hosted for a number of offices and elected district attorneys reentry simulations that is sort of a brief opportunity for prosecutors to learn a bit what it's like to be released from prison and have to sort of find your way in the world. And oftentimes, the folks who go through that simulation come back saying, oh my God, I just did not realize, exactly what it meant to try to function after being released. And, to me, that has not been a point of emphasis, but it makes sense. People who are prosecutors typically are not also going through the system. And one thing that we need to do is raise awareness about just how difficult it is to succeed after release and figure out ways that we can support returning citizens. And to DA Gonzalez's point, I mean, if we are going to take seriously the idea that folks, who are going to prison and coming home, community members that we have to keep safe. Part of what it means to keep them safe is ensuring that they have access to employment when they're out, ensuring that they have access to housing, ensuring they have ample resources to buy food. It is not going to work if we're not providing the resources and support that returning citizens need.
Absolutely.
This is an area that highlights two important things in my mind. One is the importance of having people who have been through the system as part of the conversation about how to solve it. And the other is about the need for collaborative decision making. So a student of mine called me a couple of months ago to say, I have an idea about SNAP benefits in prison. And I said, what is that? And sort of not understanding that there was an issue. And he said, well, you're entitled to SNAP benefits when you get out of prison, but it takes 8 weeks for the paperwork to be processed, and you can't fill it out until you get out of prison. So then you have 8 weeks during which you can't access your food stamps yet. And I want to fix that. So together we went to the leadership of several prisons and to the Department of Social Services and said, would it be possible for us to identify the people who are getting out in 8 weeks, bring someone into the facility to fill out the paperwork with them then, so that they're able to access their food stamps immediately upon release. And we're now on track to hopefully launching that in several prisons starting in the new year. And this is the kind of thing that simply would not have come to my attention, but for the fact that a young man who experienced it himself raised it. So it goes very much to the mantra of the movement that I think is so important, that the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And it also illustrates how when you bring in multiple agencies that have power to make change, it really can, sometimes through minor changes, drastically impact the success of people coming home.
Right.
Lucy's point is right to very important and needs to be amplified, which is people who have come home who have been impacted by the system are telling us what they need to be successful, and we need to listen to that. So in Brooklyn, what that meant was that we have a food pantry so that we can battle, food insecurity as people are coming home because of the issue that Lucy mentioned, that people often don't have, the resources even to have food. So we have food that we do here that they can come. It was open during the pandemic. That people could come and get food here. People who are involved in our reentry. We also have a clothing boutique that's named after my predecessor, Ken Thompson. So people can come and get clothing as well, and high-end quality clothing, so that they can go to a job interview as well as regular leisure wear. So it's important that we listen to the needs, but these are the kind of things that progressive prosecutors are trying to do in their office to support their communities.
Thank you, Diego Gonzalez. We have about 6 or 7 minutes left, so I would like each of you to, and as you make your closing comments, to kind of address the whole issue that brought us here in the first place. Responses to COVID-19, the pandemic, and any type of emergency management situation. And we are wondering, is there a role for progressive prosecutors that they can play in minimizing the harm caused to incarcerated people through the pandemic and any other type of man-made or natural disaster?
So I'll go first. I know that DA Mosby has also done a lot of work around this. In my office during the height of the pandemic, I stopped prosecuting most misdemeanor cases. We declined to prosecute in a period of time in excess of 1,600 cases, and my rationale was that we needed to keep people out of the justice system who didn't need to be there, criminal justice system. And we were concerned about the rise of COVID in the city. New York City was hit very hard early, and we thought that it would spread around our criminal justice system. And so I simply said I wasn't going to prosecute these cases unless there was a public safety reason to do so. For example, if we needed an order of protection in a domestic violence case or something, yes, we'd bring the case into the system and bring them before a court. But we weren't going to ask for bail on most cases, and in many cases, we simply declined. We also took a hard look at people who were detained pre-trial. And we were able to reduce the pre-trial detention of people here in Brooklyn by 25 to 30%. And so we simply got people out of our local jails so that we could reduce the density and hopefully make it easier, but also to make sure people did not get sick. And I took a look at people who had the highest risk of serious health issues or death because of their own sort of health reasons. But we did a lot of other things. And so I think as a progressive prosecutor, you have a lot of ability to help and to do things that not only make our criminal justice system fair, it also speaks to the legitimacy of the system, because right now the system is tinkering on illegitimacy. And so we need to make sure that people have confidence in the system. And I think prosecutors play a big role. And so we went, we released people, and I'm going to tell you that we've been keeping track of the people we released, and over 80% of them have not been rearrested. You hear other stories that people were released, and there was a lot more crime done, and that may be true in cases, but the releases we made were made based on public health concerns, and obviously with an eye toward safety. And in Brooklyn, we were able to release people safely. They have not been reoffending, and they've been returning to court to deal with their criminal justice matter.
Thank you, D.A. Gonzalez. D.A. Mosby?
So I agree. And as I touched on earlier, I think there's absolutely a role that progressive prosecutors play in minimizing the harm caused to incarcerated individuals, especially during a global sort of pandemic. And so what we did very early on, as I alluded to earlier, was that we met with public health experts and we understood the impact of this virus, that it had the potential of becoming an incubator within these prisons and jails, and that it would ultimately impact the overall spread of this virus in our overall community. And so very early on, I can tell you that we, in addition to setting our own decarceral guidelines, we weren't prosecuting, as I stated earlier, trespassing and minor traffic offenses and rogue and vagabond and prostitution and drug possession cases. We also advocated for the governor to set statewide decarceral guidelines, where in essence, because of our advocacy, it led to the governor actually doing so and the release of over 700 individuals statewide. We revamped our bail policy, as Eric was talking about, looking at what cases we were making recommendations for individuals to be held without bail. We, in essence, made a lot more release on your own recognizance, and it's had us re-examine and reassess what our bail sort of recommendations were in the first place. We agreed to the release of over 160 inmates following the governor coming out with a comprehensive sort of plan on setting those decarceral sort of guidelines. And as a direct result of the decarceral guidelines that we set in Baltimore City, as I stated earlier, 75%, there was a 75% decrease in the drug possession arrests from the year before, and a 45% decrease in the number of individuals that were incarcerated from the year before. And so, and finally, and last but certainly not least, we quashed, my attorneys went in, filed the motions, argued the motions in front of a judge, and we quashed and dismissed over 600 cases, and some of which we're still going through with the underlying offenses for those offenses that we no longer prosecute in the city of Baltimore. So there is absolutely a role that we play. Prosecutors are the ones who decide who's going to be charged, what they're going to be charged with, what sentence recommendations they're going to make. We are the ones that make a decision as to whether someone gets into the criminal justice system in the first place. It is an awesome power, an awesome amount of discretion that we should be using to better the criminal justice system overall. And that's what we've attempted to do, especially during this global pandemic.
Thank you so much, D.A. Mosby. Candidate Lang, your thoughts?
Thank you so much, Ronald. And thank you, Just Leadership, for the incredible leadership that you show in New York City and nationally on these issues. Thank you to these incredible DAs for sharing your expertise, and Michael for bringing the perspective of the IIP here. the pandemic really highlighted the epidemic of mass incarceration. And of course, these DAs and many others were already working on solving it. But in a way, the pandemic highlighted it for the public such that we're now in a position that there is tremendous public attention that enables us to really have the appetite to enact policies to solve it. My friend Shawana was born in prison, and she entered the foster care system and then herself was in prison by the time she was 17 years old. She has broken the intergenerational cycle of prison by founding a nonprofit dedicated to supporting people coming home from prison. Partnerships with Shawana and others who are directly impacted by the system are the only way to truly reimagine the American legal system during this unique opportunity that we have in the wake of COVID. And we urgently need leaders like these who recognize that and have the experience bringing those voices to the table and implementing the changes that they deserve, that we all deserve. Mass incarceration can be solved in this generation. It was paused in a single generation. And I hope that the listeners will join me and my fellow speakers in building a system that's committed to ending mass incarceration, prioritizing racial and gender equity, and treating everyone with dignity. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for those powerful comments, because they're right in line with our mission of cutting the prison population in half by 2030. And Director Khan, you have the last comments. What are your thoughts, please?
Thank you so much to you, Ronald, to Just Leadership, and to all the other panelists. What I would, I think, like to leave folks with in sort of reflecting back on the pandemic is leadership matters. You've heard amazing expertise and vision on this panel. And what I will say is, communities around the country can elect prosecutors like the ones on this panel. There are so many people with amazing vision, expertise, and the ability to operationalize change within a prosecutor's office. And for too long, these elections have basically been uncontested. And what we're seeing now is that people are really paying attention and trying to hone in on what is the vision that I want in my prosecutor, and do I think they have the leadership and expertise to actually make it happen. And so what I will encourage everyone listening to this panel is ask yourself, am I paying attention to this race? Am I getting other people to be involved in the electoral process? And am I working with my community to make sure that we have someone in office who has our values and shares our commitment to justice?
Thank you so much. And on behalf of Just Leadership and our president, Deanna Hoskins, I'd like to extend sincere thanks and gratitude for each of our panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules to educate our audience. And I give special thanks to our audience for tuning in and listening to this most powerful conversation we had today. And going forward, we look forward to having another conversation in the future. So stay tuned. Thank you for all your good work and stay encouraged. Take care, everybody.